But again,
but Secretary Rubio, we don't know what any of that progress is. And the president went into that meeting.
You're not going to.
Okay. Can you name any concessions that Vladimir Putin made during this meeting? Have any
I wouldn't name them on your program.
Have any concessions
I wouldn't name
been
them
asked?
on your program. Why would I do that? These peace deals, these peace agreements and negotiations, they don't work when they're conducted in the media, either through leaks or through lies. And usually they're both the same thing, lying leaks. Okay, they don't work if you do it that way.
Ladies and gentlemen, picture this. A Sunday morning interview where politicians usually get grilled and exposed by tough reporters. But this time, things went differently. Marco Rubio, sharp and prepared, flipped the script. The reporter, who thought she had the perfect trap, ended up walking right into his counterattack. And in the end, she was the one who instantly regretted it.
Now by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for joining us this morning. President Trump has touted this summit as a huge success, but the president going into that said he wanted a ceasefire, he wanted the killing stop, and there would be consequences. Let's take another listen to what he said just before that summit.
Will Russia face any consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to stop the war after your meeting on Friday?
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will the consequences
There will be
be?
consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences. I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire.
So, Mr. Secretary, the fighting hasn't stopped, the killing hasn't stopped, and there is no ceasefire. What changed President Trump's mind?
Well, I don't think his mind has changed at all. I think ultimately, if this whole effort doesn't work out, then there's going to have to be additional consequences to Russia. But we're trying to avoid that by reaching a peace agreement. And that's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of work. I think there were things that were identified in those talks that we just had a couple days ago that made some progress in some directions. Now, obviously, in order for us to get a peace agreement, Ukraine has to be a part of it. They have to be included. They have to be involved. That's why the president called them on the phone immediately after we got on the airplane. Within an hour, he talked to them for long periods of time. That's why President Zelensky will be traveling to Washington tomorrow, along with several European leaders as well, to continue to work on this. We made progress in the sense that we identified potential areas of agreement, but there remain some big areas of disagreement. So we're still a long ways off. I mean, we're not at the precipice of a peace agreement. We're not at the edge of one, but I do think progress was made towards one. But again,
but Secretary Rubio, we don't know what any of that progress is. And the president went into that meeting.
You're not going to.
Okay, the president went into that meeting saying he wanted a ceasefire and there would be consequences if they didn't agree on a ceasefire in that meeting, and they didn't agree to a ceasefire. So where are the consequences?
Well, that's not the aim of this. I mean, look, first of all, you're not going to reach
the president said that was the aim.
Agreement. Yeah, but you're not going to reach a ceasefire or a peace agreement in a meeting in which only one side is represented. That's why it's important to bring both leaders together, and that's the goal here. The president has said what he'd like to see at some point is we make enough progress so both leaders, Zelensky and Putin, can meet somewhere and finalize this. The only way to finalize a peace agreement is you have to have both sides agree to it and both sides of it involved. How many times have we heard from the Ukrainians and from others? There is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Well, Ukraine wasn't at the meeting, but this was a very important meeting. Now, ultimately, if there isn't a peace agreement, if there isn't an end to this war, the president's been clear there are going to be consequences, but we're trying to avoid that. And the way we're trying to avoid those consequences is with an even better consequence, which is peace, the end of hostilities. That's the aim. That's the goal here. And the president, he deserves a lot of credit. This is not our, look, when he says this, it's true. The United States is not at war. This is not our war. Ultimately, what daily life in America looks like will not be materially altered one way or another about what happens in Ukraine. We have dedicated time and energy to this because this president has made it a priority of his administration to promote peace and end or prevent wars. He's made that a priority. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for the amount of time and energy that we have invested in something like this. And he's the only one in the world that could do it. Okay, none of these other leaders in Europe could get Putin to a meeting to talk seriously about any of this. So this is going to be difficult. It's been going on for 3.5 years. You have two very entrenched sides, and we're going to have to continue to work and chip away at it. I think we made some real progress. You talked about not knowing what was discussed. These peace deals, these peace agreements and negotiations, they don't work when they're conducted in the media, either through leaks or through lies. And usually they're both the same thing, lying leaks. Okay, they don't work if you do it that way. And they don't work if you go out and say aggressive and abrasive things about one side or the other, because then they just walk away.
The reporter, let's call her the liberal Karen of the day, came out swinging with her best weapon, Donald Trump's own words. Before meeting with Vladimir Putin, Trump had promised a ceasefire and warned of very severe consequences if Russia didn't stop. But the fighting in Ukraine continued. No ceasefire, no peace. So the reporter hit Rubio with the obvious question. Asterisk, where are the consequences? It seemed like a solid trap. Trump made a promise, didn't deliver. How could Rubio defend that? She looked confident, convinced she had him cornered. But here's where she miscalculated. Marco Rubio wasn't new to this. He's faced tougher questions, tougher critics, and as he put it, tougher leaders than a TV journalist. This wasn't his first interview of the day. It was his third. He was warmed up, sharp, and ready. When pressed for details, what progress was made, what Putin had agreed to, why Trump didn't act, Rubio didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward with confidence. Asterisk, peace agreements don't work when they're played out in the media through leaks or lies. And usually they're the same thing. Boom. Just like that, he shifted the whole conversation. Rather than letting the reporter drag him into messy specifics, Rubio made her look naive, like she didn't understand how real diplomacy works. He wasn't going to hand her a headline that could complicate talks with Russia. And viewers at home likely nodded along. Asterisk, yeah, that makes sense. You don't negotiate peace on live TV. The so-called Karen thought Rubio would slip. Instead, she was the one left looking like she was playing games.
Any concessions that Vladimir Putin made during this meeting? Have any
I wouldn't name him on your program.
Have any concessions
I wouldn't name
been
him
asked?
on your program. Why would I do that?
Where is the
Well,
pressure?
of course, because you can't have a peace agreement. No, you can't have a peace agreement unless both sides give and get. You can't have a peace agreement unless both sides make concessions. That's a fact. That's true in virtually any negotiation. If not, it's just called surrender. And neither side is going to surrender. So both sides are going to have to make concessions. So of course concessions were asked. But what utility would there be of me going on a program and tell you we wagged our finger at Putin and told him you must do this and you must do that? It's only going to make it harder and less likely that they're going to agree to these things. So these negotiations, as much as everyone would love it to be a live pay-per-view event, these discussions only work best when they are conducted privately in serious negotiations in which people who have to go back and respond to constituencies, because even totalitarian governments have constituencies they have to respond to, people have to go back and defend these agreements that they make, and figure out a way to explain them to people. So we need to create space for concessions to be made. But of course, concessions were asked.
Does the president favor giving up territory that Ukraine now controls, specifically in the Donetsk region? Sources are telling us that's what was asked.
Well, first of all, I mean, Putin has given repeated speeches now for 2.5 years. There's one they always cite, which talks about taking most of Ukraine and his view of history and how so forth and so on. The second thing the president is, so we know what their side is demanding, and we obviously know the Ukrainians are not in agreement with any of that. The second point I would make is the president has said repeatedly, when it comes to territories and territorial claims, that's ultimately something Ukraine will have to decide. It's their territory. It's their country. Ultimately, what they're willing to live with is what they'll have to decide on. Maybe the answer is they're not willing to live with any of this. We don't know, but that's what we need to explore. In the meantime, the one thing we do know that Ukraine has said repeatedly and publicly talked about is security guarantees. They need to be able to enter into security guarantees that ensure that this is never going to happen again, that they're not going to get reinvaded in 2.5 or 3 years or 4 years or whenever it may be. They don't want to be back here again. They want to be able to go on to rebuild their country and live their lives. That's a very reasonable request. That's something we're working on, and that's something the Russian side has to understand, obviously, is that as a sovereign country, Ukraine has a right, like every sovereign country, to enter into security alliances and agreements with other countries. So these are some of the...
Rubio didn't pretend progress was easy. He admitted the talks were tough, that Ukraine wasn't even at the table yet, and that any deal would ultimately have to be worked out directly between Zelensky and Putin. But he stressed something the reporter didn't seem to understand. Diplomacy isn't a Twitter fight. It's slow, messy, frustrating, and often invisible. And this was the brilliance of his pivot. By refusing to play the media's "give me a headline now" game, Rubio highlighted the seriousness of the mission. He painted Trump as the only leader capable of bringing Putin to the table. Like him or not, that was a powerful narrative, turning a question meant to expose weakness into a case for strength. At one point, the reporter pressed again. Asterisk, can you name any concessions Putin made? Asterisk, Rubio smirked, and you could almost hear it in his voice. Asterisk, why would I do that? Asterisk, with that single line, he shut her down. He explained that yes, concessions had been discussed, but announcing them publicly would only harden positions and kill any chance of peace. That's Negotiations 101, and Rubio spelled it out clearly. Instead of making her question look sharp, he made it seem reckless. Think about it. If the U.S. is truly working toward peace, why broadcast your leverage to the world? Why give Putin a chance to twist it or walk away? Rubio was right, and the audience knew it.